This is something that every industry producer understands. I've watched just about every single melody tutorial, and not once have I heard anyone talk about this. And just by doing this, you're going to make your beat sound 10 times better. Alright, what's good YouTube? So in this tutorial, I'm going to be breaking down the melody making process that all industry producers are following from beginning to end. Basically, I'm going to be covering everything you do and do not need to know when it comes to making your melodies. Specifically, I'm going to be covering how to create unique but effective chord progressions, note and scale selection tips, how to create melodies and counter melodies that complement your progressions, common mistakes people make when laying down their melodies, how to humanize your melodies, along with various tips and tricks along the way. Let's start with essential practices. Right off the bat, when you're making a melody, what a mistake people will do is they'll just go in there without any kind of like guide for what they're going for, any sort of vibe. Like if you ever seen the episode of The Cave with Kenny Beats, there's a reason why he's always asking the artist at the beginning like what kind of vibe they're going for, because that's going to be kind of like the framework for every decision you make, whether it's like adding notes, changing the pitch, laying down chords, choosing a scale, picking presets, and etc. And as well, with something that I talk about more than anything on this channel, but if you haven't heard already from me, 1-note gaps are used for more dark and evil vibes, 2-note gaps are used for more like emotional stuff, and 3-note or higher gaps tend to be used for the more anthemic stuff. So that's just another way that the vibe is significantly going to determine how you go about making your melodies. Also, another big mistake, and one of the most common ones you'll see, is that people will start making their melodies on bad presets. And when you're doing that, you're kind of just shooting yourself in the foot. I'd say when you want to start with a piano preset most of the times because it's dry. Like it's the most common element in music, so you're probably going to use it in your beat itself. It's easy to hear the mistakes as well in the notes since it sits a lot in like the mid frequencies. But what's also very important is it's sensitive to note lengths, which you'll see is super important when browsing through presets. Finally, the last thing you want to remember before you start laying anything down, you just want to come here and turn the volume down originally. It'll sit somewhere like right here. I usually just bring it up to right here. The reason for this is that the drums are going to be even louder than the melody itself. So you want to leave like headroom to add those elements, because not only do we want them to naturally stand out, but if we have to turn them up like crazy to do so, we're just going to have a lot of clipping in our mix. So before anything, also you want to have a scale in mind that you want to use. The type of scale really isn't too important, but here's a little trick that producers like Metro Boomin, Murda Beats, OG Parker, Wheezy, and many others understand, is that they'll tend to use the E flat / B major scale, because coincidentally this scale is by far the easiest one to remember, and it's also in the octaves that like most rappers will rap in. You literally just need to use all the black keys, and the only thing you need to remember is that you also use the F and B keys. And also, if you want to go for the more evil stuff, it's the exact same thing if you want to use the figurine scale, which Metro Boomin does a lot, which is the exact same rule, except instead of using the F note, you use the E note, and you still use all the black keys plus the B key. And for the more emotional beats, like the type of stuff that you hear out of internet money, the most common scale you'll see them use is like the C minor scale. This one's not as easy to remember, but I strongly recommend you remember it, because at the end of the day, what you can do is just kind of pitch your melody up and down to your liking. But if you're a beginner, I strongly recommend doing this because it's a good way to learn. And for those who are wondering, the quickest way you can get a scale range like this is you come up to this draw thing right here, you right click it, and you come down here, and the minor scale that you want to select is this Aeolian scale. It's really just a minor scale. I don't know why they call it that. And what you can do is you can kind of just like lay it out here, and whatever notes you like, you know, you can shift it around. Let's say I want to make a scale in the A minor octave. You want to put in like a sampler track, and you want to mute it. And now when you go to make your melody, basically you'll just have this framework with all the notes that you want to use, and every single note that you lay down in this framework is going to sound good. So if you're a beginner, I strongly recommend doing that. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about chords. There are various types of chords, like many different notes, but what's important is really building like the fundamentals by starting off with basic ones and then just like adding notes later. This is another example of like one of the most common mistakes I see a lot of producers doing, is they'll start with like a ridiculously complex chord, like something like this. If I were to play it like this, like that doesn't sound good at all. And you know, when you're making something complex in the beginning, you're not really giving yourself like enough space to be creative and like do all these different things. But like, as you can see here, we have 3 notes right here that work. And if I were to play this, like there's so many more things I can go off of from that than the more complex chord. So don't be like laying down ridiculous things. Really just stick to the simple 3-note chords, and then add like all your other variations in like melody later. Like see, for example, if I want to go evil, I could do something like this, lay this down, something like this. Or I could just like clone it like that and do something like this on some like sad vibes. And as you can see, it just becomes so much easier when you do it like that to like add notes and add changes to it. It's just easier to hear like what to do and what not to do. But moral of the story, just don't start complex, keep it simple, and just stick to 3-note chords. So basically now if we're actually going with like variation and making different progressions with the chords, this general layout is something that you need to like remember. So once you have like the chord that you like, what you want to do is you just want to start with like singular notes. You don't just want to like blindly lay out chords. You kind of just want to play along with it like this, like I like that note. I'm really just looking at the root notes here. So then you want, after you select a note, then you want to build your chord progression around it. So it would be something like this. Like that sounds good. Seeing right there, I have a very simple framework of a progression that I can add so many different things to make it sound so much better. But it just serves as like a guide for where I'm trying to go with this whole melody. You know what I mean? And also before I move on, here's just one more producer mistake that I see a lot is a lot of times people will be making their chord progressions like this, and then they'll be like laying out some sort of like counter melody while they haven't even finished the progression. And that's gonna be really difficult to do. So I'd strongly recommend don't start like thinking of counter melodies and melodies and trying to like recreate whatever you have in your head like before you even have like the basic framework laid down. Do the chords first, then think of like counter melodies and melodies later. Now you may be looking at this progression, some people may think it's like good the way it is. That's another common mistake that producers will make, is that they'll like leave their progressions to be way too generic and they don't really know ways you can spice them up. So here are 3 ways industry producers will make their progressions more interesting. 1, they'll move the chords around also while using the slice tool to create kind of like a rhythm. You need to understand that chords are also a framework for the bouncier melody, and because I feel like not enough people consider this when making their melodies, they really just go for sound. 2, by adding more voices and by adding notes to the progression. This is usually done by adding a bass line. Know that you don't need to make your progressions be only 3 notes. You can still maintain the progression, but you want to make sure that you add more voices. Also, similar to the previous tip, you'll also see notes be added right before the chords change to give the melody more character and rhythm. 3, by shifting the notes around to new octaves. This one is also very important. Just because you're using the same notes doesn't mean it'll have the same feel when you place it in different octaves. Usually the first and third notes are the ones that really drive the progression. So what you'll see a lot of producers do is they'll either delete or they'll change the pitch of the second note up an octave. So with these 3 things, at the end of the day, it comes down to personal preference, but just do what sounds good to you and make sure to try these things out before just calling in the day with your melody. And this next thing is probably the best tip I think I've ever heard, especially because I don't really see anyone talking about it, is that you gotta make sure the notes that you use at the end of your melody, whether it's like a lead or a counter melody or a chord progression, makes sense with the first ones that you're playing in the very beginning. Because what I used to do is I would just listen to the second last chord or note that I'd be playing, because this also applies to your leads and counter melodies, by the way. But I would just listen to the second last notes and I'd just make sure they made sense with the last, and I would just call that a day. You need to understand that like it's not like you're just playing the melody and it's stopping there. It's technically playing on loop. So it's really looking more something like this, where like the progression is constantly going. And if you want to constantly be playing on loop, which it will be with the beat, the ending needs to make sense with the beginning, or else like that clear disconnect will stand out and it'll just ruin the beat. So like for example, that's why you'll see so many of like the same progressions being used in the beginning when producers are making their melodies. And like a lot of the times when I heard people's beats when I'm doing the beat reviews during live streams, is that like they'll have this issue. So just make sure that these notes make sense with these last ones. And skipping a little forward, likewise with another melody that I made here, there's like a lead. It also applies to this, where like the first note that's playing in the beginning sounds like this, and at the very end it sounds something like this. See how those 2 notes at the very end make sense that this would be the next note that plays? So it goes like this. But like I could leave it like this, and this note could have been like this note, for example, and now listen to it. See how that doesn't sound right? Like even though it's still in scale and still aligned with the actual chord itself. So just make sure to consider that because it's super important. Okay, so now let's talk about the lead or the counter melody or the melody. Usually just the part that sticks into the ear of your listener. First off, a big mistake that a lot of producers will do is they'll try and force themselves to create a lead, when in reality they just might not need one for their melody. Specifically like when your chords aren't really looking like a progression anymore. You know, there's a lot of slices and a lot of different notes being added and a lot of variation. But by far when it comes to making leads, the biggest mistake mistake that I see people make is that they'll use like way too many note lengths and rhythms in their melody. It's kind of like the same rule with hi-hats in the sense that like too many types of hi-hat rolls is just going to throw the listener off and be too hard to follow along with. The same thing goes for melodies. See, what people don't understand is that a lot of melodies do have some sort of groove to them, and industry producers understand this. So that's why you'll see them do stuff like not necessarily draw each note individually, but they'll just go like the cloning option. So they'll do stuff like this, where this is quite literally what I did to make this counter melody. They'll just like drag something over or clone it over like this, and then they'll just kind of like move certain notes. Like as you can see, that's just what I did right here to make this like this. And you know, it kind of forces you like, so you still are going to follow like the exact same groove that you set down in the very beginning, but it's also just going to force you to like keep things simple and just not overdo it. And it's just also going to be in general like easier to do. But likewise, generally it is a good idea to keep things simple, but you know, find a balance between the two where it's not like super boring like this, but it also doesn't look something like this. And last but certainly not least, the final mistake that I see a lot of producers doing is not understanding how to properly pitch shift their melodies. Producers do this all the time, but don't seem to understand why, because it's not necessarily a matter of preference, but it's a matter of having like the root notes in your melody, or in other words, the lowest notes in your melody, sitting above the C5 octave. Because for producers who don't know, like 99% of the time, you want to make sure your 808 follows the root note, and 808s start to like not sound good below like the A4 octave. So you just want to make sure and like consider that. Like for example here, like if I were to have the 808s be like in these notes specifically, it's either going to be really high pitched or super low pitched, and I kind of want to sit like somewhere above the C's, but like I don't want to be super muddy. So you want to look at the lowest note of your melody and just shift it accordingly till the lowest note sits in this range. You know, I would just pitch it up, ideally up somewhere up here. So now like the lowest note is playing at this B, which is generally acceptable. And the final thing you do need to know how to do is how to humanize your melodies. What you want to do is when your melody is finished, highlight everything by hitting Control A, and then go to your keyboard and hit Alt R, and that'll open this randomizer right here. And what you want to do is come down to this levels knob and just kind of like mess with this velocity knob. And as you can see, what it's going to do is it's going to give random velocities to all the notes in your melody. And what that's going to do is kind of make it sound more like it's being actually played by a person, because when you're playing something by hand, you know, you're always going to have like random velocities. It's not going to be consistent with every note you play, and that's something you want because it generally sounds better, especially when you're using stuff like pianos or instruments that a person would normally play. And I guess one final mistake to mention is that what a lot of producers will do, more experienced ones in particular, is they'll just like come in here and they'll just highlight and they'll go to randomize. They'll just go like this, and then they just move on from there. But like a lot of the times when you randomize it, like certain notes, like for example, I can guarantee these ones down here are just going to be like hit a little too hard or be a little too quiet. So just make sure that before you move on, just play through the melody one more time and just kind of like correct the velocities of each note. So like for example, right off the bat there, this root note right here, this C4 note is hitting way too hard. So what I'm going to do, and this is what you should do, is you should hold it with left click and then use your mouse wheel, and then you can just pull down the velocity like that. Or what you can do is just highlight and go like this. That's honestly probably the better way to be doing it. And yeah, that's basically it. Don't overdo it by having like crazy velocities, but just make sure there is slight variation to them when you do feel necessary. All right, but that's going to be it for this tutorial. I've done sound selection, mixing, and now melodies. So let me know if like drum patterns and effects is something you might want to see me do next. Make sure to follow my Instagram and Twitter at FinnaFinesse. Go cop my personal stash drum kit, Most Wanted Volume 1. There's a link to that in the description. And yeah, make sure to like, subscribe, and peace.